Alex Honnold is perhaps the most famous rock climber in the world. His climb of El Capitan in Yosemite, California, with no ropes or other protection, what climbers call free solo, was dubbed by the New York Times as one of the greatest athletic feats of any kind ever.
I had to put a lot of preparation into free soloing El Cap just because the objective El Cap was so daunting. I mean, it was hard for me. It's big, it's intimidating. It was just a lot.
That year, the National Geographic documentary that followed his climb won an Oscar, and millions got to know Honnold and his climbing. The exposure also allowed Honnold to redouble his efforts for another one of his passions, fighting the climate crisis through the Honnold Foundation, which carries out projects across the world providing renewable energy to communities from the Ecuadorian Amazon to Memphis, Tennessee.
You lost a lot of friends due to climbing. And just living here is kind of like free climbing. You never know when you're gonna make it back home.
So what's behind this drive to create a more sustainable world? Welcome to Generation Sport. I'm Iman Amrani, and I've come here to Nevada to speak to world-renowned climber Alex Honnold. I've come to speak to him about the work his foundation does around the world, his philosophy and approach to life, and how things have changed since he's become a father. So the Oscar-winning documentary about your journey to free solo Yosemite's El Capitan came out 5 years ago. And at the beginning of that documentary, you're living in a van by yourself. How has your life changed since then?
Well, yeah, it's changed a bit. I mean, now I'm living in a house and I have a daughter, and my girlfriend in the film is not my wife. But in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed that much in that I'm still basically climbing full-time and still trying to do the same things. You know, I mean, in general, I'd say life is a little broader now with a wife and a daughter and just more going on.
And you also have a foundation that does a lot of work, and you said in your book that sometimes it's difficult to speak about that work publicly because people often want to talk to you about climbing, fear, and death, and not so much about that work. Why do you think it is so difficult to talk about that?
I think that most people are more curious about the sensational things, the rock climbing, the risks, like the big drama, and nobody wants to talk about energy access in the world and, you know, energy poverty, energy equity, like solar projects, or even just environmental issues in general. You know, I mean, none of that's quite as exciting as risking your life on a big wall.
You've said somewhere that you think it's really important to live intentionally, and that can mean lots of different things to different people. What do you think it is that distracts people from living intentionally? What are the things that you have to push away in order to prioritize?
I mean, that's individual to anyone. You know, what do you care most about? But in my case, a lot of that is cutting away societal expectations and things where it's like, how are you supposed to dress or look, or what are you supposed to do? And like, are you supposed to live in a certain way? And you're like, no, you just live however you want, because ultimately we're all just gonna die. You may as well have a good time on the way.
And did you find it quite easy to push away all that stuff, or is it something that you constantly had to, at some point, push back against?
I think for me, it's always been relatively easy to live intentionally because I've always loved going climbing more than anything else. And so it's been easy to shape my life in service of climbing, you know, making whatever choices necessary to maximize the amount of time that I can spend outside climbing. I think that the challenge for people to live intentionally is if they don't know what they're living for, necessarily. You know, if you don't know like what you want to do most, you know, and it's like, you should get up and seize the day. And people are like, well, what am I seizing? Like, what am I doing with my day? And as a passionate climber, you know, I always know what I want to do that day, which is either train, climb, or rest.
I think that's like a really big part of why your story and your journey resonates with so many people. You finding what it is that you want to do and you then executing that and then pushing yourself in that, it speaks to a lot of people and inspires them. So having you explain that, I think, is very powerful.
Actually, it is interesting because I think about this a lot more now as a parent, because I feel like so much of parenting is just allowing your child to find the thing that they care about enough to get out of bed and try hard on. You know, it's like, it seems like a real gift to find that. And, you know, it's been a gift in my life to find that for myself. And now I'm sort of like, well, I hope I can help my daughter find that at some point, find something that she's passionate about enough to keep her motivated for her whole life, basically.
So the 2018 National Geographic documentary, Free Solo, won an Oscar and introduced both yourself and free solo climbing to a huge audience. And when I watched the documentary, I was struck by the amount of preparation and how you planned to the finest detail the most difficult and intricate parts of El Capitan. But when you've done other climbing, like in Patagonia, where you were doing several days and you're having to climb over rock and ice, it requires different skills. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit about the balance between the psychological and the physical preparation for these different types of climbs.
I had to put a lot of preparation into free soloing El Cap just because the objective El Cap was so daunting. I mean, it was hard for me. It's big, it's intimidating. It's just a lot. But not all climbing objectives require that degree of preparation. And then the other part of that question about psychological versus physical preparation, I mean, it's sort of interesting because climbing is a physical sport, but free soloing is so mental. I mean, basically, there's always a little bit of both. And so depending on what you're training for, what you're trying to do, you know, sometimes the mental side is more important, sometimes the physical side is more important. It really depends on what you have and what you're aspiring towards.
They say that no man is an island, but at the beginning of the documentary, you are living in a van, you don't have many attachments to the external world, and by the end of it, and also where you are now, you're married with a kid, you have a house, you have a foundation that does work all around the world. And I wanted to know if that was something that you intentionally set out to do or if it organically grew around you.
I mean, so I started the Honnold Foundation years before the film Free Solo. I mean, it's over 10 years old now, so, you know, I'd already been working on the foundation for maybe 5 years when I free soloed El Cap. And I'd always aspired to have a family one day, to have, you know, meaningful life partner, things like that. You know, I mean, I want to grow old and be a grandparent and all that. You know, it's always been part of the plan, but I've always wanted to rock climb quite a bit as well. And so, you know, I've been doing things in the right order, trying to.
One of the reasons I think the documentary is so popular is because people see it and they see that you're very self-sufficient, and sometimes out of necessity or circumstance, it's easier to kind of control your life and what you have going on than it is to let in external variables that can affect things. And I think there was like an interesting point in the documentary about how you introduce balancing out a new relationship with your rock climbing and the world that you care about so passionately. And then it meets this point where somebody who really cares about you wants you to maybe make decisions that you don't want to do. And I think it's difficult to balance all of that stuff. It's scary rock climbing, but it's scary being in a relationship. How did you feel about the kind of response to all of that stuff? Because it was something that I think touched a lot of people.
I think a lot of people see the film and they think that I'm quite callous, which is fair. You know, that I'm uncaring, that you know, I should have prioritized the relationship more, and it's totally fair criticism. But I think that when you look at it in the bigger picture of the whole arc of my life, it kind of makes sense that this climbing objective that I've been working towards for almost 10 years, that I prioritize that over this relationship, even though it was a great relationship. But, you know, I'd only been dating this woman for 6 months or a year when we started filming, when I started working on the climb. And so even though she seemed incredible, and she is incredible, which is why we're now married and have a family, but, you know, you're kind of like, well, this lifetime dream, you know, sort of outweighs this budding new relationship. But I think a lot of people watch the film and they're like, wow, that guy really is like prioritizing the wrong things. And you're kind of like, well, in the broader context of life, you know, you just have to choose the right things at the right times. I've told my wife this now. I'm like, I'm so glad that I free soloed El Cap when I did and didn't sit on it for a few more years until we were married and did have kids and did have, you know, other obligations in life, because I think it would be much harder to take on a challenge like that, you know, as a father now.
There was one part of your book that particularly struck me that I wanted to talk to you about, and it was about when you went on a trip to Chad to film a documentary called Towers of an Eddy. And you wrote about how seeing the simple facts of Chadian life made me realise, perhaps for the first time, how easy my life was compared to those in less privileged societies. That insight would lead me a few years later to redirect my goals towards something more other than climbing. It took a while to sink in, but that was the epiphany. Can you explain what that epiphany was exactly and what it was that it led to?
I mean, you know, epiphany might be too strong a word, but I mean, I guess it was the first time that I really examined my own life and where I'd come from. And I grew up in suburban California, and everything's pretty easy, you know, pretty comfortable. You know, just middle-class parents, good education, everything's fine. And then going to rural Chad, which is the middle of nowhere. I mean, we drove for days without roads across open desert, and then you run into communities of people living, you know, as they probably have for thousands of years, with like literally no infrastructure, no modern trappings of civilization. It's just like living in the sand. And you know, we spent several weeks there climbing first ascents on these big sandstone towers, and like these kids would come and watch. I mean, there was just a lot about it. It just made me appreciate my own, you know, my own circumstances that I never really appreciated. You know, because it just seems normal when you grow up in the suburbs. You're like, yeah, this is how everybody lives. And then you go to other parts of the world and you're like, no, this is a lot harder.
And was that, I guess, the first time you say it led to you doing other things? Was that what led to you wanting to start the Honnold Foundation?
Yeah, that was a big part of me wanting to start the Honnold Foundation. You know, I mean, the direct beginning of the Honnold Foundation came from a handful of other things, part of which had to do with my own rising media profile and sort of success. I was sort of uncomfortable with the fact that I was suddenly making more than I needed, and there's so many people in the world that have so much less than they need, and I was like, oh, that's not really fair, considering, you know, I've sort of fallen into a very lucky place in my life doing the thing that I love to do most, and, you know, getting paid for it. You're like, that's cool. And
when we're talking about something like a foundation or the privileges you have and how different people live, I wonder if you kind of grew up with that, I guess, moral awareness, or if that was something that you developed through your climbing and the traveling that you did.
I think I was maybe a little bit primed for that kind of moral awareness because my family traveled a fair amount, and my grandparents actually traveled quite broadly. So I grew up seeing pictures of my grandma riding camels and things like that. And you're sort of like, oh, you know, so I grew up sort of with an appreciation of the broader world around me. But then I think seeing it directly with my own eyes really made that sink in quite a bit more. And yeah, I mean, to me, the sort of issues of basic fairness, you know, it's like, and particularly, you know, it's a little cliche, but when you see kids abroad, you're sort of like, it's just by the roll of the dice that I was born in suburban California and some other kid is born in rural Chad. And it's like, you're both just kids. You're both just appearing in the world. And like, why does one child get to have a really easy life and another gets to have a very difficult life? It's like, there's no real fairness in that. And part of starting the foundation was just my attempt at grappling with that inherent unfairness in the human situation.
And it's quite interesting because climbing in itself can be quite a solitary thing to do. It's in nature, it's not around lots and lots of people. So I find it interesting that you still managed to meet and interact with people whilst you were traveling, and the fact that what you do and the work you do.
So climbing seems like sort of a solitary sport in a way, especially free soloing, but actually I think that climbing interacts probably more than almost any other sport. You interact with normal people in normal places, because the thing about climbing is you have to go to the rocks, and rocks are typically in the most rural and far-flung places on Earth, and then you stay there for quite a long time while you work on climbing projects. So you often wind up living in rural communities for weeks at a time. And you're there to climb, and you're doing these difficult climbing objectives every day. But then you also see the kids just growing up in this village.
You have partnered with the project Memphis Rocks. So that's been around since 2018. That is in Memphis. And it combines climbing with one of your other passions, which is solar power. And I wanted to know why you got involved in that project specifically and how it works.
Well, I mean, Memphis Rocks is a good example of what I'm trying to do through the foundation, which is help people in a way that's good for the environment. And so with Memphis Rocks, I mean, Memphis Rocks is technically a climbing gym, but it's really a community hub, a community organization. It's like it does everything. It's a food bank, a clothing bank. It helps the local community in any way that people require. And then the Honnold Foundation put solar on the roof, which basically just saves them their utility bill. And that's just more money that they can put directly into the programs that help their local community. And to me, that's the sort of clear win-win, where you're like, oh, you can help decarbonize the grid, you know, kind of help the environment in a general sense, but mostly it helps this local community in a very specific way. And, you know, I love win-win projects like that, because you're like, I don't want to see Memphis Rock spending a bunch of money, sending money to their local utility. It's like, the utility is doing just fine. You know, like, they don't need it. Like, nobody cares about it. I mean, the Memphis utility in general is pretty regressive and really not doing anyone any favors. Like, you know, I was like, screw them.
Yeah, I found that project very, very fascinating. But do you find that you have much time to go and visit these projects? And no, how is the relationship with them ongoing?
No, so in general, I try not to visit all the projects that we're funding. I mean, at this point, we've funded dozens of projects around the world. And if I was trying to visit each one, that's basically just sort of a weird touristy thing. I mean, the thing is, we're supporting community organizations around the world, and we're trusting our partners to do what's best for their community in a way that's good for the environment. I have sort of misgivings to any kind of philanthropy that's based on like me going to watch a thing happen. So you're like, I don't need to see it. It's nice to occasionally contribute to projects, and I've volunteered at a few things and like actually tried to help, and occasionally you visit to make a film or do something where you can highlight the work that they've done. But in general, I think the guiding principle with the Honnold Foundation has always been seeing the project, like getting the projects done, like as long as the work is actually happening.
And I know that you're very passionate about the Maya Impact School in Guatemala. Could you explain a little bit to me about what that's about?
Yeah, so the Asociación Maya runs a school for indigenous girls in Guatemala, and it's one of my favorite projects just because it's such a clear win-win sort of situation where the Honnold Foundation helped finance solar panels on the school. It saves them something like $10,000 a year, which in rural Guatemala like that is, probably another teaching position or whatever else. I mean, basically it's more money going into teaching indigenous girls, which to me is a perfect situation. They're also doing an educational component around it where the girls learn about the panels and they do a whole educational thing. But the important thing for me is that the school has more money to educate kids. That's, it's like, why waste money paying utility or whatever else when you could be putting it into the project that you're there for, which is educating children.
And where was it that this particular focus with solar energy came from for you? Was it something you've always cared about? Was it something that you learned about through some specific moment, or? I
just wanted to support environmental projects that improve standard of living, that sort of helped humans. Because I learned one thing through expeditions was that nobody cares about the environment if their basic needs aren't met. And so, I care deeply about the environment. I cared about climate change. I'm worried about sort of our global future. But I realized that there are literally billions of people on Earth that don't care about that kind of thing because they're too busy meeting basic needs. And that's totally understandable. But I felt like there's no real point in protecting the environment in a broad sense if you're not also helping humans meet their needs. Because, someone will cut down the last tree on Earth if it means boiling water for their family. It's like if they need fuel, like they'll take it where they need it. And so, I felt like if you're trying to protect the environment, it starts by helping make sure that people have everything that they need. So that's kind of where the Honnold Foundation started. And we just wound up consistently funding solar projects around the world because solar is so often an elegant win-win solution where people can meet their energy needs while doing so in an environmentally, relatively friendly way. It's like kind of the best option in most places. And so over the years, we've just doubled down on supporting solar projects around the world.
I think about this quote that somebody said that there's a reason why the journey up a mountain is so long and the space at the top is so small. When you achieve that peak, like you did when you free-soloed El Capitan, you have a platform. And I wonder if having that platform changes your viewpoint from before in terms of what your legacy is.
Yeah, well, so I actually started the Honnold Foundation years before I achieved anything super meaningful in sport, kind of knowing that if I was ever going to do anything big or mainstream, like I kind of knew that I wanted to do something useful in the world. And so I wanted to start the Honnold Foundation, but I also knew that if I started it sort of a little bit early in a way, like before I was fully ready for it, that it would kind of naturally grow with me, and that when the time came, it would be able to really blossom on its own. And that's really worked out exactly how I hoped, because now we're 10 or 11 years into the work that we've been doing through the foundation. And certainly in the last few years, it's really been taking off, where we're supporting dozens of projects around the world. We gave over $2 million in grants last year to small-scale organizations. Basically, we're just giving so much more than I ever thought was possible. And yet, in the grand scheme of global philanthropy and certainly in global finance, like that's nothing, and it barely even touches the problems that we face. There's a lot of money going to large-scale climate philanthropy. You have something like the Bezos Earth Fund, putting like $1 billion into climate. But most of that's going to like big bet technology sort of things like direct carbon capture from the air and sort of like next generation fission, thinking of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there's certainly a place for that kind of stuff in the world. I mean, like it's great that people are looking at the solutions for the future. But when you think how much need there is on Earth right now and how easy it is to meet those needs, it's like some of the projects that we're funding, it's like a $50,000 check to some community organization, and it can totally transform their way of life, like having light for the first time, having refrigeration for the first time in some rural community. It's like those are transformative to humans' lives. I'm kind of like, it just seems morally I don't want to say morally questionable because, you know, I mean, funding any kind of climate philanthropy, I'm like, yeah, it's great. But it's like when there's that much need that's unmet in the world, I feel like you should start there.
Obviously, inequality and the climate crisis matters a lot to you, but how do you prioritize all of that? Like, where does that come from for you? Is it just something that you see and you learn through meeting people and talking to them? Is there any philosophy that you feel like you subscribe to?
Yeah, I mean, I've read a fair number of books about things like this over the years, but I think ultimately it just comes down to me doing what I feel comfortable with, what allows me to sleep well every night. I do sleep well all the time, but so I partially because I'm always tired from exercising, but I mean, I donate roughly a third of my income every year to the Honnold Foundation, to environmental projects around the world, and to me that feels like an appropriate start. And you know, I wouldn't even be surprised if I start giving more than that in the future. But you know, for now I'm like, oh, I don't know how to buy a house and have a family and support my child and stuff. But at some point, you know, those obligations will be met. You know, like my personal obligations to family and my community will be met. I'm sort of like, you know, then you just give the rest of the way.
It's fascinating to hear that coming from outside of the United States. I mean, I'm from the UK and we have people buy things they don't need and consume things they don't need. But it's interesting to hear you talking about that being in America and also living not that far from somewhere like Las Vegas.
Consumption capital of the world, like totally insane. Yeah. But I feel like, you know, that sort of vacuous consumption, like people just buying they don't need. You know, everyone's like looking for something that they care about. You know, they're trying to buy things to fill a hole or to make them feel better, to have whatever. You know, I'm sort of lucky enough that I don't need to fill those holes because I go climbing all the time. Like, I know what I love to do. I love what I do. I'm happy with what I'm doing. Like, I don't need to buy random stuff that I don't need. I will say, actually, I think if we're really going deep on this, at a fundamental level, I come from a worldview of sort of abundance. Like, I think that there's more than enough for everybody to go around. It's more about equitably distributing what we have. Like, we don't need to make more things. Like, there's so much. You know, it's like we just need fewer mega yachts and things like that.
We did say at the beginning that people often ask you about death because of the risks of, for example, free soloing specifically. But I wanted to ask you about it in a slightly different way, because when you've done all the work that you've done and you are invested in something which has, I guess, a legacy, and you have a daughter as well, I want to know what it is that you really want to be known for leaving behind at this point in your life.
Oh, I mean, I'm pretty proud of the climbing that I've done because I put a ton of work into it, and some of it is pretty cool. You know, like it's hard. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if when I'm old, I'm more proud of you know, my family or the work that I've done through my foundation, or who knows what else I might even start in the next 50 years of my life. You know, I mean, I'm always going to be proud of the things that I've done as a rock climber, but I'm definitely open to the fact that other things in my life will probably surpass them.
And I do want to kind of end specifically talking about your daughter and how that has changed your perspective. Looking at things like the climate crisis in the future, do you think that having a child yourself has impacted on, I guess, that importance that you see in protecting the world that we live in so that you can pass that on?
No, it's actually, I mean, it's a natural question that I get asked a lot. Like, do I care more about the environment because I have a daughter now? And the answer is basically no, because the reality is my daughter's going to grow up relatively comfortable her whole life, regardless. You know, I mean, the worst effects of climate change are felt by the least privileged people on Earth. You know, it's like basically the billion or 2 billion poorest people on Earth are the ones who are most affected by a change in climate. And so, you know, my daughter's going to grow up in air conditioning. Like, she's fine either way. And that, you know, really that sort of highlights the unfairness of it all. You know, for most of us, our kids are going to be just fine. You know, it's like there'll be higher seawalls around some of the major metropolitan areas. There'll be like, you know, different pumping systems. There'll be like for most of the developed world, we'll adapt as we go. But it's really in the developing world that people are going to be the most personally affected by a changing climate. And that's, you know, I mean, that's the same sort of issues of unfairness that helped me start the foundation, you know, 10 years ago.
Thank you for coming and speaking to me about these things today. I think it's really important to be able to platform the work you do with the foundation as well as the climbing. So I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. No, it's a pleasure chatting.